Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and this time we're going to be asking the question, should Star Wars have ended after the original trilogy? And I think it's important to note that in this exercise, that means there was no expanded universe, and no prequels, and no sequels. So just the first original three films, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, and that's the end of the story. And honestly, as someone who grew up during the time of the prequels, it's hard for me to envision a Star Wars universe in which that storyline doesn't exist. But I also can understand the argument for that first original trilogy just really being a solid story on its own. And for a lot of people, that is Star Wars. That's the George Lucas original Star Wars vision. The story of Luke Skywalker and the redemption of Darth Vader. And at the heart, that's really what Star Wars is supposed to be all about. Now, in the years that have passed since the original trilogy, they have obviously branched out and told a lot of different stories involving different characters. I will note, though, that the prequels are important because they add a lot of context to the story of Darth Vader. You really get to see Anakin Skywalker and how he fell to the dark side and how Darth Vader was created, essentially. And while you don't necessarily need that information to understand that Darth Vader was an evil person who was once a good man, and that's brought back out in him by Luke, who shows him compassion as his son, saving him in the end. But it does add a lot of context, and we get a lot of cool characters and just a bigger expansion of the universe itself with the prequels. But I do understand the argument that the original trilogy had the perfect ending as far as wrapping up the storyline. I know there are some issues with Return of the Jedi and the pacing and the Ewoks and a lot of things that some fans are not super high on, but overall, I think people do agree that the original trilogy is the most solid in the franchise. And I really do wonder where the franchise would be today if Return of the Jedi had truly been the ending of that story. The entire generation of fans that grew up during the era of the prequels wouldn't have had that to latch onto. Yeah, it's very possible they still would have gotten into Star Wars by having the original trilogy be introduced to them by the older generation of fans. I mean, for me, I was born during the time of the prequels, right before the prequels came out, and that was not my first introduction to Star Wars. I was shown the original trilogy as a kid, and then the prequels coming out was just adding on to that, but I already had a love of Star Wars because those were some of the first movies I saw. So the original trilogy definitely has a lasting legacy and a lasting impact, and I think for new fans even today to get into Star Wars, it's a really good starting point. Even though chronologically, technically you would watch episode 1, Phantom Menace, and kind of go through the saga from there, but honestly, starting with the original trilogy and experiencing the surprise twist of Darth Vader being Luke's father for the first time, and really getting to know those core original characters, that makes up a huge part of what made Star Wars special. So in my personal opinion, I feel like the prequels should exist, but I do not feel like the sequels should exist. And that's not even just because the sequels weren't great movies, in my opinion. But at this point, it feels like Disney has gotten so far away from the story of Anakin Skywalker because there's not a whole lot more you can tell. The story of Star Wars, being the story of Anakin Skywalker, his fall and his redemption, is pretty much summed up in those 6 films. The original trilogy shows the ending of his story. The prequel trilogy shows the beginning of his story. Not only did the sequel trilogy fail to add anything to Anakin Skywalker's story, but it undid a lot of the events of Return of the Jedi with the heroes having a victory. It's pretty much undone, and you realize that all their efforts and everything they went through, in the time span of 30 years has completely fallen apart. And that's where I feel like the story should not have continued from that point. And if you absolutely had to or wanted to continue the stories of those characters, the expanded universe did it way better. You know, more interesting concepts, deeper storylines that really went into the family lineage and really kept that story a consistent piece. Now, don't get me wrong, the expanded universe was far from consistent because you had a lot of different authors and a lot of different visions coming together. So I know there are a lot of people out there that really cling to the original trilogy as being the true Star Wars, and that's fine because I do think that is the foundation of Star Wars. Everything that we have is based around those three films. Everything that came before, everything that came after. And I do think at some point Disney's going to reach that level of not being able to continue to add to the lore because there's only so much you can really expand upon in the universe without it becoming repetitive or completely unnecessary. You know, we don't need every side quest that happened in between the 2 days between two films and the kind of things that they could get to if they really keep milking the franchise for what it is. I'm not saying I want to see them stop making Star Wars altogether, but it has to be meaningful Star Wars, and it has to add something to what we have. You know, we can't just be making Star Wars for the sake of making Star Wars. That's when quality starts to go down and the franchise gets watered down to a point where things that are actually really good and valuable to the franchise are lost in the mix. And it's true that the original trilogy was lightning in a bottle. It was a magical combination of things that happened to all work out. A lot of risks were taken, a lot of changes were made along the ways. George Lucas was notorious for changing his mind on the direction of characters or storylines many times throughout the creation of those films. And the finished product we got actually worked out pretty well. And we got not only one of the most iconic movies from that time, with the original 1977 Star Wars just completely taking practical effects and visual storytelling to an entirely new level, just to be followed up with what is considered one of the greatest sequel movies of all time with The Empire Strikes Back, which was the perfect follow-up that really, really expanded upon the characters and took them to a whole new level. It's truly magical that that trilogy worked out the way it did, and I don't think that's ever going to be replicated. But anyways, that's all I got for this video. Let me know your thoughts on the original trilogy in the comments below. Do you think we needed the prequels? Do you think we needed the sequels? Do you think Star Wars would have been fine with just those three movies? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you're not subscribed so you don't miss out on any of the Star Wars content we got coming out over here. And as always, may the Force be with you. Now let's blow up that like button and go home.